Show. Hello, welcome back to Quibbles Over Coffee. Today we are talking about the insurrection at the Capitol.
Well, actually, we're kind of talking about whether or not we want to call it an insurrection, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's
the question.
That's the twist. That's the twist today.
Yeah.
So yeah, why don't you introduce it? What's the backstory?
What's the backstory of the Capitol? Okay,
Yeah,
so
just go through.
The Capitol was a thing that happened. So
Yeah.
a bunch of violent white supremacists stormed into the Capitol building while there was a vote that was supposed to secure and complete the process constitutionally of the election in 2020, and to get Biden to be officially the president of the United States, or the president-elect at that point. And this is, many weeks after a lot of attempts by Trump to overturn it in the courts. He also, prior to this, had been caught on a recording, trying to pressure and even threaten the Secretary of State of Georgia, which is obviously wildly inappropriate. He had also been illegal, yeah, probably. I mean, I'm not a constitutional lawyer in that context, but yeah, probably illegal. And this is also a situation where for literally months, both before and after the election, he was talking about how if he lost, it was rigged. He claimed that the day of the election itself that it was that he had won, and that therefore we should stop counting. Although he also wanted us to keep on counting in the states that he was still losing in at that point. Yeah. This is a really awful event. People died at the event, and there was a point where, because of one very, very brave, I'm blanking on his name, but one very brave person who was working security there, he convinced by sort of ribbing a bunch of the white supremacists, because he was a black man, to follow him up the stairs. He was able to keep them away from running into the Capitol building. It's into the Capitol itself, the chambers themselves, where there were at that point still like 60, 70 members of Congress and member of the Senate, still there. Obviously cowering in the bleachers, because of course they are, because it's terrifying when people with guns. Also, they had some of them were wearing Nazi paraphernalia. Others were wearing America First stuff, which, for those who don't know, these are specifically coming from the what's his name? I'm blanking on his name, but there's this white supremacist, Nick Fuentes, that's his name, coming with Nick Fuentes flags. All of this is really dangerous and really awful. So the question is sort of like, what do we call this, and how do we respond to it? And there are some people who have been talking about this as being terrorism, but there are others who have been trying to talk about this specifically as white supremacy. There's a question of like, what's the response when something is white supremacy versus what's the response when something is terrorism?
Yeah. There's actually a really great social justice toolkit that I invite everybody to read. And it's by Nicole Nugent and Yazan Zaza. And it's called Why Treating White Supremacy as Terrorism Won't Work and How Not to Fall for It. And essentially what they kind of say, which at first I was like, okay, yeah, this is definitely domestic terrorism. And the reason why they said we kind of don't want to fall into categorizing this as terrorism is because of the counterterrorism efforts that were made and the programming that was made in response to like 9/11 and in response to so many attacks that we have had in like our history, and how that response normally affects Muslim communities or like Black communities with like Black Panthers and things like that. And also how, especially when we're looking at white supremacist or white supremacy de-radicalizing programs in the past that actually are still happening now. I think Life After Hate is one of them. And how those are ineffective as well, because essentially it treats white supremacy in its most radical form, and negating the fact that white supremacy, even in its covert form, is violent towards Black and Brown communities. And just like the response of that from the government and government surveillance, not only on what they claim to be white supremacist groups or right-wing groups could also fall on social justice groups as well. So it's a very interesting take on that. The one thing I will say about this when I was reading it was kind of like, okay, so I understand that, but what exactly are we going to call them? You know, because it's kind of like people are very stuck on this domestic terrorism term.
Right.
But I have actually just been calling it white supremacist violence. And I don't know if that's like encompassing everything in terms of what happened, but to me, it is like the epitome of white supremacy in this country, in terms of like essentially what Trump was campaigning on, essentially like the people who were in the Capitol, what their intention was. It's not only just because of the election being stolen. I mean, let's be honest too. I mean, a lot of these people were angry about the results in Georgia, and like Black people were voting in Georgia and came out in record numbers. So it's kind of like, you know, anytime that we have election results like this, and we have people in Black and Brown communities actually voting in large numbers like this, I feel like that this response was like a culmination of all of those things, of Trump's, you know, racist rhetoric, of white supremacy historically in this country, especially embedded in our politics, and just like the outcome of these elections, and these being like historical moments for Black and Brown communities and like the voter turnout. So I think that to me, like it just makes more sense to label this as like white supremacist violence, because I feel like when you label it with white supremacy, then I think it is easier to have more conversations about white supremacy's influence in America in general and American politics. Whereas if we just call this terrorism, then it's kind of like, oh, well, you know, these people are terrorists and they're like separate, you know, from everything else going on in the country and every other systemic problem in the country. And I think it's like kind of like a get out free card for some people. And also kind of what the toolkit explains about, you know, the counterterrorism efforts, and like in general, terrorism itself had a very anti-Muslim sentiment. So,
sure. Which is an interesting component of it, because I think obviously, I mean, there are a heck of a lot of reasons, as you just discussed, that calling it terrorism get to sort of, we have a toolkit of how we respond to terrorism, which is basically let's go invade somewhere in the Middle East, right? And that is a toolkit that's sort of been the go-to in the United States for a long period of time at this point, for many decades, perhaps even more than a century. And so my concern, though, is how do we fix the response to terrorism without broadening the definition of terrorism? Because right now, terrorism is pretty, I think in the minds of many Americans, terrorism and Muslim are sort of synonyms in a way that's really dangerous. And I think that talking about white supremacist terrorism might be a way, this is a question, I'm not sure, of trying to complicate the definition of terrorism.
Yeah. And I think that was kind of something that I was thinking of too, and reflecting, because I was like, you know, in one way, I do understand that if we label this as terrorism, we're going to go through the process of essentially, like you said, the terrorism toolkit. I mean, it will be slightly different in terms of like domestic terrorism. I'm not necessarily sure of what the structure of that looks like. But yeah, like the term terrorism is synonymous with being Muslim, you know, and it is kind of like, well, you know, if we call white supremacist terrorists, then maybe that will break up that kind of image that we have. But then at the same time, I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking of, you know, Joe Schmo out there like posting like Holocaust stuff, you know, like posting like things about, oh, like conservatives are, are being, hunted like, in the Holocaust or something like that.
Yep.
And like Gina. And essentially, it's kind of like, okay, so we're just going to say that like a certain person in a certain group is like a terrorist. So then that means that anyone else who feels like they don't fall under that can kind of continue their behavior and it not be something that's addressed,
Interesting.
So it's just kind of like, to me, I feel like, especially now in this time, like overt and covert racism is violence. So it's kind of like, I'm not sure if kind of separating the radical white supremacist extremist from everybody else is a good idea,
Yeah, we actually were talking about this a few episodes ago. But I guess my question and my thought is that the people who are covertly racist wouldn't see or identify themselves as white supremacists. So what does putting that label on the whole group of like the whatever at the Capitol change that? Because they still wouldn't see themselves as falling under that umbrella,
Right.
regardless. So
Yeah, there's a very quick sort of response on the right of, oh, everyone, the left calls everyone a Nazi, which I mean, like, I'm sorry, but when Marjorie Taylor Greene goes around talking about space lasers and how I have a space laser and all the other Jews have space lasers, like, yeah, you're a Nazi. Like, yeah, that's Nazi behavior. Like, yes, you don't have to literally, be gassing Jews to be obviously anti-Semitic and obviously, trying to talk about those same kinds of ideas that have been discussed really dangerously in the past. But it's difficult because you're right that there's a lot of underlying problems that aren't the same as that overt context.
Yeah, and it's just kind of like, and it kind of seems like right now there is more discussion about how to handle people sharing things on social media, or kind of like sharing certain ideologies that would be involved in some way that could possibly become some kind of radicalized, like white supremacist violence at some point or something like that. But then it is kind of like, I don't know, to me, it just seems like even if that person doesn't think that they're a white supremacist, or if they call them terrorists, think that they're a terrorist or whatever, it's like, what is the government's response going to be to this? Like, how are we going to change the structures of our government if our government is able to compartmentalize white supremacy into, oh, well, white supremacy only happens when something like the white supremacist violence on the Capitol happened, but not when we are blatantly redistricting in communities and keeping people from, funding in certain areas, like, it's just kind of like, I feel like it will be an easy way to kind of be like, oh, well, we got rid of the white supremacist, so now we can go back to how we were. And it's like, how we were is why this happened,
yeah, but I think my main issue with this rebrand is that not calling it what it actually like legitimately is dangerous for people in the future trying to say like, oh well, I'm not a white supremacist and I'm gonna go do this, but B, also just like the repercussions, because I think like saying that something that happened was domestic terrorism and saying that something that happened was an act of white supremacy have like different connotations and different like they feel like they're different, and so like having one for one thing and one for another thing when it's the same, when you're talking about what like the same thing, I feel like that's kind of dangerous.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like, this is such somewhat of an odd comparison, but like what's coming to my mind is that we have this term sexual assault. We have also this term rape, and there's an understanding that both of them are bad. There's also an understanding that they're different, and I don't think that we have that same worldview with respect to racism, or with respect to anti-Semitism, and with respect to sort of white supremacy. Of there is, the white supremacy of let's literally burn crosses on Black people's lawns, and there's the white supremacy of let's gerrymander, as you were talking about, or
Right.
let's try to make it more difficult to vote in urban environments, or let's try to make the school districts underfunded in certain areas. Let's try to all of that kind of stuff. That's I think perhaps at this point in our country's history, perhaps more dangerous at a generalized level, but is also very different on sort of a personal level. Yeah, it's hard.
What do you think?
I think part of it probably there's like another aspect of like the kind of like bad faith, like conservative mentality, like victim mentality of like no matter what you call it, there will be like like a Ben Shapiro type or a Glenn Beck type, where it's like whatever term ends up being used, they're just going to say, oh, that means all conservatives. Like they're just going to put everyone under this umbrella, like they're coming for you, they're trying to get you, whatever, type thing that they already do with certain.
So what you're saying
stuff
is
like that.
if they name this as like domestic terrorism, then like Ben Shapiro will be like, oh, they're calling us terrorists. Like, we have a reason to be like.
Well, he won't say us, he'll say you.
Yeah.
Like, because he's talking to his audience, like.
Right.
They're calling you
And
a
because they do
terrorist.
this, I mean, they do it already, like with pretty much everything. Like it's all about someone's coming for you type.
And that actually kind
rhetoric,
of, I mean, that's a good point, because that actually kind of worries me too. Like if they're called, like, yeah, because that does give people like on the right, like especially extremist right, to be like, oh, they're labeling me a terrorist now. I guess I might as well just be a terrorist. Like,
Which
I guess I might as well just
I
like.
guess so. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Which I don't think
I
is.
don't know.
I don't think it's a good reason to not do it. I guess if that makes sense, like the rebrand type deal. Like I don't think like you could just like worry about like what are conservatives gonna say, how are they gonna twist it or whatever. But also
Yeah.
it is something to like consider.
I mean, at that point, yeah, if you're willing to like, I don't know,
You'll twist whatever it ends up being into something, so you might as well just.
If you're willing to
anyway.
like, strap a bomb to your chest or something, like you're already radicalized. I don't think it matters if someone is calling you a terrorist or not. But it does kind of like, especially with, that rhetoric of like, oh, we're taking the country back, or, we have to fight for our lives and our children and our families, and essentially like, trying to build like a fascist country, and then you are like being labeled as a terrorist, or at least you think that you're being labeled as a terrorist. I'm just wondering like what the response to that will be. I don't know. I mean, it was so easy for them to storm the Capitol, at the beginning.
So easy. Right.
Yeah.
Which is worth unpacking. I mean, the difference in terms of security between Black protests and white conservative protests, those are hugely different in so many ways. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it is important to put white supremacy in that, because I mean, partly the reason why the security was so lax was because it was a lot of angry white people like coming through. And there were quite a few like police officers and like just people in general who were in on it, who just kind of let them through. And I mean, you and I were at the Black Lives Matter protests, like when they first started, and we know the kind of military presence that was out there when those things were going on. I mean, we literally had people like military police out with snipers on top of buildings while we were all just having like a parade, and we weren't anywhere near the Capitol.
Right.
So, that dichotomy between like that and the Capitol was just disgusting to me, because it just kind of showed me like,
Yeah.
this is white supremacy, you know? Like,
Right. And a lot of people were talking about making that comparison the day of the attack. And, you know, there were a lot of people on the right who were like, why are you mad that people didn't get killed when they were storming the Capitol? And we're like, no, like no one's saying that when white supremacists are doing this kind of stuff, that they should get killed. What we're saying is that, hey, maybe when black people do this, also they shouldn't get killed. And there's just like you know, pointing out that difference in the response. There seems to be an assumption on the right that therefore, when we've been talking this whole time about how police respond to black people, and then we point out that this is the difference between how they respond to black people and this is how they respond to white people. That's someone we're saying that they should respond to white people differently rather than they respond to black people differently. Yeah, it's very odd. It's very odd indeed.
I mean, there was even a segment when they were there about, because I guess at that point the police were retaliating and were shooting like the bags at them, and they're shooting us like they shoot the black people, and it's like they know there's a difference in like how black people are treated. They were just hoping because I'm white that they wouldn't do the same thing to me, you know. And at the time they didn't, until they realized, oh shit, like this is actually a bigger problem than we thought. And then, you know, we're starting to deploy the same things that they were deploying when people first started doing the Black Lives Matter protests. And then, of course, you know, the people there were like, well, you know, we're white. Why are you treating us like this? You know?
Yeah. It's weird. Yeah. I'm curious, like, what do you think is the value of protests? What do you think is what should be our goals when we protest?
I think certainly the goal is not to kill people. Certainly the goal is not to try
That's a good start. That's a good start. Yeah.
Kidnap people and like hold them for ransom or kill them on TV or anything like that. You definitely want to have a plan when you have a protest, which that's another thing that I was thinking of, like all the QAnon protests and like things like that. They never really are like asking for anything. Like they're never demanding anything other than like
they were.
What was that?
On the 6th they were. On
the Capitol, like they were, but in general, it's like when you have a protest, like you have certain demands that you have, and you have a strategy for that. And then it's kind of like, like, what is your message? What are you there for? Hopefully it would be, you know, peaceful and no one gets hurt. Like I said, you don't want anyone to get hurt. You want it to just be like a statement and like to voice your demands.
Right.
And to me, I know that there are people who have this debate about the Black Lives Matter and like, you know, some of like the Black Lives Matter protests with like people destroying like property or whatever. And there's always going to be people who do some stupid shit. Like you're out there to peacefully protest. You're out there with the message. There's always going to be people tagging along just because they want to cause like disruption or whatever. And that was, to me, like that is not what the Black Lives Matter protest was about. Then again, it's like destroying property is different from actively trying to hurt or injure people. But at the same time, I'm just kind of like, to me, it is like being peaceful, having a plan, giving out like demands of what you're seeking. And essentially, like I said, strategizing with people in your community to go to these places and show your elected officials that you are holding them accountable and you do want to see differences. And, you know, this is what's going on with us, and you do need to pay attention to this, you know. And I think that's a great way too in protests when people come out to educate them, you know, like have people out during those times who are handing out pamphlets or handing out resources to get people registered to vote, or like to get people talking about, you know, the civic process. That's always welcome in protests. And I think that should always be present. So, mhm. What about you?
I mean, pretty much the same. I would view protests as like just showing people like in your community that what people in that community believe. Because like when you're just walking around every day, of course, like you can't just see, know what people think. So like when
Mhm.
those groups of people get together and they hold signs or they chant or march or whatever, it's the people in that community saying, this is what we believe. And it kind of it brings issues into the community or exposes issues that already existed.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the registration component is actually a really important one. I mean, I was curious to see how how valuable the Floyd protests were in terms of the number of people who were registered. And the CNBC article suggested it was about 500,000 Latinos, an additional I don't remember the exact number of African Americans, but a huge number of people were ended up getting registered because of this. And those are also young people. And it's important to register anyone, but I'd argue that it's even more important to register young people than any other group, because young people obviously are disproportionately going to be Democrats, and also young people are disproportionately going to stick around for a while and keep on voting in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hopefully these are going to translate to a voting bloc that's going to continue to be important going forward.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and an informed voting block too, because if you're
Yep,
going out to
exactly right.
protests and learning this information, because they do talk about this stuff at the protests, you're gonna get hopefully educated in the right way and be more willing to vote in the future and in local stuff and like just be involved in general. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people sort of look at protest as being, the march itself is the end goal, which I think is just like fundamentally a flawed thought process. And I think it's a thought process that sort of suggests that you haven't actually been to a protest, right? Because like when you're actually at a protest, like the vast majority of the work that's being done on the ground is actually about, can you register? Will you register now, please? Here's how you register. Here's the piece of paper, literally, so that you can register, right?
Mhm.
Like, we're going to be talking with the state senate in a little bit, and would you come talk in the state senate with us? And hey, like all of this sort of behind the scene work that's extraordinarily valuable. It requires these sort of flashpoints of sort of broader discussion with the public. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know like it's like when you're in protests, like there is an energy about it. Like,
Sure.
it's great to be with like like a community of people who all want the same thing, and like it is like energetic and awesome. But at the same time, it's like you said, it's more than just a protest. It's about like getting people registered. It's about, hey, fill out the census and like things like that. Some of the things that sound a little more boring, but at the same time, it's like there's so much other things that need to be done, and not necessarily just focusing on the protest itself.
Right. Awesome. Any other thoughts, or should we call it a day?
I'm good.
Cool.
I think
Okay.
I'm good. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
for
you for
listening.
being on.
And we'll see you in the next one. Like, comment, and subscribe.